Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Bechdel. I am a media analyst. I live in Denmark, but most of my focus is more on the global world of media. So what I do in my job is I look at the trends around media and the patterns that we see in media, but also increasingly around the behavior of media. So I look at the way people behave when they use media, but also how the market behaves towards media. One of the things I've been looking at a lot over the past couple of years is this new trend we see around news fatigue. Or when I say new, it's been around for a long time, but it is something that's been growing a lot over the years. So news fatigue is a really big problem because once people stop being interested in news, either because they are tired of it or because they just avoid it, as journalists, we start to lose our ability to kind of do the things that we do in order to keep the world running on and to hold those in power to account. So in this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what this is, what the numbers are, but also how it affects us and what we should do about it. Before I start though, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between news fatigue and news avoidance, because they're not the same. News fatigue is when people have basically burned out on news. It's when people have too much news of a single topic, or we have too much pressure, or there's too much negativity, or in any way that where people just have reached a point where they just can't handle the news. I want to give you a very simple example of this. What you see here is a front page of a news site here in Denmark. It's one of the largest news sites that we have. And this screenshot was taken on November 9th, 2020. So this was about a week after the US election. What you see in the right side of the screen here are all the articles that are just about the US election. And the problem is when we create so many stories about just one topic, we burn people out. The result is something like this. This is from an opinion article that was posted. And what you see here is a person saying, please save us from all the wall-to-wall talk about the US election. We want to know more about our neighbors. Imagine if some of the resources spent by the media reporting on the US election have been used to tell us what's happening in countries close to us. And what's really interesting about this message is not only that as an analyst, I completely agree with this, but also listen to what this person is actually saying. This person is not saying that they don't like the news. This person is saying that they like the news, but they just don't feel what we're doing right now to be the most valuable thing that we have. So they want something more relevant, something that is better, something that is more useful to them. And this is a very simple way to illustrate news fatigue, because news fatigue does not mean that people don't like news. It's something else. However, if we as publishers then don't listen to people, we end up with what we call news avoidance. This is the point where people have tried to tell us that they want something better, but we just keep giving them a lot of news that they can't handle. What happens then is that people see the news and they see all these stories and all this negativity we give them. And at some point, something breaks and people say, I don't think news is relevant anymore. And so they drop news and in this case, throw out the TV and replace it with a goldfish. I mean, whatever people like to do. And this is the problem with news avoidance, because once we reach this point, we have basically lost our audience. So there's a big difference between the two, but they tie together, and obviously they have something to do with each other. So let me talk a little bit about what the numbers are today. And there is a lot of studies that we could talk about. This is not necessarily a new thing. It's been going on for many years. But I want to talk about the latest numbers we've seen. So right now, as we all know, we are in the middle of a pandemic. And in the UK, Ofcom have been doing a very comprehensive study about this. In the beginning of the pandemic, they measured every single week how people were using news about coronavirus. They have since switched it to a bi-weekly, but it's still very, very comprehensive. What they found was that back in April, 23% of the UK population had already started to say that they wanted to avoid news about coronavirus. Now we have to remember that in the UK, the pandemic hit them in about the middle of March. So this is about 3 weeks after the pandemic started. But already there, 23% have already reached a point where the way we are doing news is just too much for them to handle. What happened then was that already a month later, this number went up to 34%. However, since then, until November, it's now down again to about 30%. And it's been fluctuating between 35 and 30% ever since. But think about how big this number is. That is 1/3 of our audience who is basically saying, I don't want the news you're giving to us. Now, there's an important thing to remember here, because there's a difference again between people who say they want to avoid the news and people who actually do it. If we instead look at the number of people who access news at least once per day, what we find is that back in April, 99% were actually doing it. And I mean, that is a staggering number just in general. So even though people say they don't want to watch the news, a lot of people still do it. By November, it's only down by 10%, but that's still a high number. So that here again, you see the difference between the amount of news fatigue and the amount of news avoidance. But this is from the UK. If we look across the Atlantic and instead look at the US, we start to see a much, much bigger problem. Here, PEP Research Center did the same kind of study. And what they found was that 71% of the public said that they felt they needed to take a break from COVID-19 or the news coverage about it. This is a staggering number. And we all know that there's a lot of other problems with media and the way people use media in the US. But 71% of the public being worn out and burned out about news about COVID, that is a significant problem for the media in the US. And this study was from April. So this has been going on since the very start. So this is just one example. However, what I want to also show you is that this is not necessarily a new problem. So here we have another study. This was a part of a report that I wrote earlier this year. And the numbers is not from me, but I wrote about it. What you see here is the difference between 2016, 2018, and 2019, again in the US. And what we see is that 59% in 2016 were already saying that there was just too much news coverage. Back then, of course, it was about the US election. Since then, in the years in between that, it actually went up to 68% and then down to 66%. And now with COVID, it's 71%. So we have a really, really big problem here. Now, I could talk about all of these studies for a long time, but what is much more interesting is to talk about why this is happening. I already hinted at it at the beginning that it's because we're burning people out and people feel overwhelmed. But it's not actually the volume of news that is the problem. It's what it does to people, how it impacts them, their mood and their perception of their own health in a way. So Reuters did a study earlier this year, it was back in May. What they found was that 66% of those people who are saying they want to avoid news, they did it because they say it has a bad effect on their mood. If we look at the study in more detail, we see that this is a significant factor of why people are doing this. Second is because there's too much news. Then we have the problem with trust. And there are people who are saying, well, it's because I can't use it for anything. So this is a really, really big problem. Now, as a media analyst, I've been looking at this for many years. And it's one thing to look at all these studies and try to understand what's going on. But I actually wanted to learn something a bit deeper about it. So last year, I did a crazy experiment. I decided to see what it really felt like to be a news avoider. So as a media analyst, which is crazy, I took 1 month last year and I became a total news avoider, completely, in order to see what happened. I learned a lot from this. I'm going to show you 2 things that was really significant about this. The first thing is that once you become a news avoider, the first thing that happens is that you start to feel that you're missing out, because you're so used to just waking up every day and seeing news and all the drama. And what if there's something you're missing? What's really scary, though, is that once you become a news avoider and you try it, after only about a week or so, this FOMO is completely replaced by JOMO, meaning the joy of missing out. And this is a really significant difference, because suddenly your entire mood around news changes. For me, it was a dramatic change. I used to wake up, reach out for my iPad, and just read the news. And you're overwhelmed by the sheer amount of negativity and problems and just all the outrage that is happening every day. When I did this experiment and stopped reading news for a month, I discovered not only that I would wake up and not have that negativity, but it will have a very positive effect on my day. I would actually feel more productive because I didn't have all this negative news lingering in the backside of my head. So this was a really significant thing. The second thing I learned was after the experiment was over. Obviously, as a media analyst, I'm back to reading the news, kind of my job. But after this experiment over, I looked back at all the news stories that I had missed, or all the front pages I'd missed for the month that I tried. My idea here was that I would go back and look at all the front pages of the month that I'd missed, and then I would write down all the stories that were relevant to me. What I discovered, which I personally find very scary, was that there was not a single story that I felt I needed to write down. The reason is the problem we have, what we call throwaway news. So in newspapers, we have a lot of stories that may seem very, very relevant on the day we publish them. But if you just wait a few days, or in my case, a month, those stories suddenly have no meaning because the world has already moved on. And whatever problem there was, well, either it has been replaced by another problem or something else. So I found doing this experiment that the relevance of news is extremely low. And this is a really, really big problem because if people try to become news avoiders and they discover this, they are likely going to stick with just not reading the news because it just makes more sense to them. So what do we do about this? Well, what you see here is a graph between bad use of time and good use of time. The problem we have today and the thing that causes news fatigue is that most of the media coverage we are doing today is at the bottom part of this, in the gray zone at the bottom. If we want to change this, if we want to do something about this, we need to scale it up a lot. And we need to instead focus on things that are more personal to people, more useful to people. So things that they might benefit from knowing, or things that they directly find interesting, not as a society as a whole, but to people individually. And the most important thing of all, of course, is we need to increase the relevance. So every story has a direct impact on people's lives. And if we do that, we can start to turn this trend around and start to get people back to reading the news. So that was a very quick and brief presentation of news avoidance and news fatigue. I hope it was useful, and thank you for listening.